Kia ora e te whānau, and welcome to our Support Staff Week celebration webinar. Before I introduce Welby, we'll begin the hui with a karakia. Mauri oho, mauri tū, mauri ora kia tātou, haumi e hui e, taiki e.
Kia ora, Ali. Thank you very much for that. We know that everyone's busy, but I do hope that everyone has managed to enjoy at least one of the celebration activities that have been organised across the Motu this week.
I know we sure have. We had the most magnificent luncheon today. We're going to be turning off the chat in a minute, guys, when you've all come in. So feel free to put any questions that you have just into the Q&A function. And we've got amazing people behind the scenes looking through those to sort of possibly synthesize them so we can get your questions answered. So we're incredibly fortunate to host Welby Ings tonight. He's going to be talking to us about the invisible influence that we have support staff have in our schools, kura, ECE and kindergarten centres. This influence sometimes not acknowledged, so it's time to celebrate it. I would like to introduce Professor Welby Ings. Welby Ings used to be a groundsman. Prior to that, he was expelled from secondary school and initially refused certification as a teacher. But he has committed his life to the health of learning environments, be these classrooms, playgrounds, communities, or countries. Welby's taught at all levels of the education system, and he has written and spoken extensively on the benefits of disobedient thought. His book, Disobedient Teaching, had significant influence on educational reform, both in New Zealand and internationally. And hot off the presses, his film, Punch, has just won the New York Film Critics Award and is being toured internationally, again in that disobedient theme. In 2001, Dr. Ings was awarded the Prime Minister's inaugural Supreme Award for Tertiary Teaching Excellence, and in 2014 and 2020, university medals for his contributions to research and creativity. Welcome, Welby.
I'm just going to share the screen. Kia ora mai tātou, ngā mihi nui naku ki a koutou katoa. Ina mana, ina reo, ina mata, ina tangata huiata. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. When I was asked to do this meeting has a lot of meaning for me, because many of us sitting here tonight dedicated our lives to education when we may not have had a great experience ourselves. And we're sitting at home, hopefully with tea cooking on the element somewhere or in the oven, and or me looking where it is going to happen at the takeaways. And you know, we often have a quite a difficult job when we have to get over the injuries to our education to be able to support people who are having a struggle with theirs. But actually, perhaps we develop a very unique empathy and a unique insight. So the aim of this is to put an arm around your shoulder, but also talk about some interesting ideas from our perspective. So if I can just put that in a context, that's my mum and my dad, and in the background, I don't know if you can see, that's our maunga. There's Puki Atua up the back. And if you were to go over that way a bit, you'd be in Arapuni, Lake Arapuni, which is part of the Waikato River. My dad was a shearing contractor and my mum was a fleeso. But my dad also did some fencing. And so we knew all about strainers and battens and wet sheep. But if we have a look at the picture, it's quite an interesting one, because Mum left school at 15 and Dad left at 12, and they spent their life trying to give their kids an education, a chance. But two of the people in that picture would have only survived because of people like you. So sitting on the swing, that's my twin sister and me, and that's Katrina, and she died a few years ago. And when she went to school, she was a darling child. She could read and write, she could write her name, she could add, she learned spelling really quickly, she learned reading really quickly. She flew through with the grace of the adored. On my mum's knee is my sister Suzanne. She was bullied so much at school that in the end, even though homeschooling hadn't come in, my parents pulled her out of school because of all her hair fell out. And she had a really, really tough time. When she went to college, she kind of got back on her feet and she became a teacher in the end. And I love her very much. And the kid with the fake nose is me. And so this isn't all about me, but I'm just going to put it in context because I have an absolute bias here. So I couldn't read or write until I was 15. And if we have a look at school for me, in our school, the idea of there'd been a big fight against streaming. And so our school decided they weren't going to stream the kids. They weren't going to ability group them, but they were going to put them into 3 groups: lions, cheetahs, and rhinoceroses. Well, I was a rhinoceros, and every kid knows what a rhinoceros is. If you're a rhinoceros, it doesn't matter what they call you, red, blue, color, whatever, you know you're the rhinoceros. The idea with the rhinoceros is that we grow up and we become the servants of the world. We stay behind to clean out the art, help put up the chairs or do the rubbish bins. And we're so looking for love and validation that we will do whatever it takes to be valued. But the difficult thing is that oftentimes people don't talk to us about our intelligence. They talk to us about being a good boy or a good girl or being trying hard. But where the other kids in the class get the description about how they think, ours is often turned into a problem or a disability or a need, rather than, and this is my belief, I think intelligence is a very varied thing and very beautiful. But what we often recognize in formal education misses a huge amount of it. And so oftentimes we get, like for instance, at school, I got through primary school because once a week we had a groundsman come in, and I would just go out and hang around the groundsman because, the groundsman never marked you or measured you. They never told you you were average or below average. They never told you you had to try harder or that you were being distracted. So inside the world of education, of teaching, formal classroom teaching, there is a parallel world of education populated by people like you. And that's a really, really important thing. And that's what this talk is devoted to. So when I went to Te Awamutu College, I was put in the bottom vocational class. My twin sister was in one of the top classes and did Latin and German, and I was I guess it's fair enough to say I was bullied. I'm not a wilting violet. I'm actually quite tough, but I was gay in the 1970s. It didn't go very well at Te Awamutu College, but the thing that is really interesting was that the geography of a school for kids who get bullied is very different. So there are places you don't go. They are things like the corridors, the lines, the changing sheds. And so we fled to the sanctuary of places like the library, where there was somebody there who didn't pass judgment on the way we were in the world. And we may not have been the best readers. We may not have been all those things, but there were people who were the parallel world that gave us safety. Sometimes it was the school nurse. Sometimes it wasn't even somebody dedicated to a role of caring for you. It's just the humanity in their heart meant that they gave you shelter and they kept you there when otherwise you would have walked. Unfortunately, at Te Awamutu College, I was invited to walk and was expelled, but that's another story. But so what the talk is, I'm going to try and do it like this. There's 35 minutes where we can talk with some stuff, and then there's 10 minutes at the end where we can have some questions. And what I'd like to talk about is how it is that people like you have such influence. And I would argue that there's 3 things that are going on there. One, we're not as constrained by the rituals of education. So we can work outside of time and we can work outside of conventions. Often we show kindness and care in a place where when you've got 28 kids in a classroom, going full on, you can't do that. And oftentimes we have lived through a different understanding of intelligence. We came to find our intelligence, and it wasn't what was necessarily lauded at school. And so that gives and so I think that we have a particular kind of influence that is not visible. It's not the one that gets held up, but it's the one that actually helps the blood to flow through the more difficult veins of a school. So if someone like you, so if we've got, imagine that we have school, what we call school. And so I don't think of people, when I was a groundsman, I didn't think of myself as support staff. The only thing that I'm supporting is not teacher, I'm supporting education, just the way a teacher supports education. But this is a parallel world in it, and it has different parameters on it. And so, but there's a couple of things that are very interesting about our situation. One of them is that teachers live in an environment of divorce, which means that every year you get a group of kids and you try to form close relationships where they'll trust you. And you try to take them to horizons across difficult territory. But at the end of the year, you'll be divorced and they will go to another teacher in another classroom. And it's a hard thing, you know, over time. I started teaching at 19 and I'm 67 now. I'm supposed to be out the door, but probably like you, this isn't my profession. This is my calling. But sometimes the people who are not teachers in the parallel world are not divorcing at the end of the year. We get relationships that actually can run for much longer. The kids will come and see us, or they'll come and see us even when we're not in that formal capacity. And they come to see us because of things like love or care or value. So we've got, and we also often are in situations where we can give more time. So for many kids, when it's a struggle at school, the thing they desperately need is time. They need time with someone's, because so they can find value again in a close relationship, in an intimate relationship, where there are not 28 people competing for it. There's just for a little bit of time, you and that person. So this is why I think it's such an important thing to invest in as a country, that it's not investing in support staff, it's investing in the parallel part of education, the parallel part that runs through. And it doesn't matter whether that is because you're running the kapahaka, or it doesn't matter whether that's because you are a school nurse or a librarian or a person who works in the office. We run in parallel, not less than, not more than, as part of a mix. So, one more thing on that. I remember a student I was working with told me this, and she was describing the lady in the office, and she said, I don't think she ever realized that even on her worst day, she was the only thing I had to hold on to. Even on our worst day, for some kids, we're the only thing they have to hold on to. You know, and our jobs are not easy. They're not easy, and they're often kind of overlooked when we talk about the difficulty of education for teachers, because it's tough. It's really tough. But actually, it's tough across the whole spectrum. And often we're asked to deal with very specific and difficult things that are not specific. They're actually not specific. They're multi-layered and multifaceted, and they're protein. They change and shift under your fingers. So I think a problem with it is that the way we've been looked at leadership is that we assume something which has sometimes been called a heroic leader. So the heroic leader is what we were brought up with. This is somebody who stands to the front and calls a whole lot of people to follow them, and they're expected to be singular and visionary, and they can solve problems, and they fearless, and they know all the answers, and they assign tasks, and they run the world by commanding people or controlling people or coercing people to do stuff. So whether you call that a movie celebrity, whether you call that a politician, whether you call that a principal, whether you call that a boss. That's the model that we've been shaped with. But actually, I'm not so sure any longer that that's actually what leadership is. And I think is another way of understanding it. Inside a normal kind of a standard school system, we're given to believe that there is a hierarchy. You know, we even have names for people. The person at the top is called the principal, and the one underneath them is called the deputy. And then there may be a team leader and a classroom leader and a junior leader. And you go, where am I? Well, petit moi is somewhere off to the side. But actually, for a child, that is not what the experience of school is, and nor is it for any individual. It's not a hierarchy. The difficulty is that that's a false structure. And sometimes we can find ourselves working in a wounded hierarchy. So a wounded hierarchy oftentimes has a person in a fairly high position who's afraid of the talent of people around them, especially below them. So they might disparage or tokenize or block. They may deliberately not employ people who would threaten their position. So we can find ourselves conflicted where you have more than one valuable person in a wounded hierarchy, but some are not able to function because there's somebody who has to protect their position by not letting other talent get too close to it. So they can be very difficult environments to work in, very difficult. And that's why I've kind of got the belief in productive disobedience. I don't mean in being, I can't find another word for this. I don't mean it's being a shit. I think it's looking for other ways where we don't throw people's backs in the corner, that we can get around something to get a better answer. So if it's not a hierarchy, let's pretend that where we work is not a hierarchy. What is it? Well, I think it looks like this. Just take a second. Imagine this is your organization. It's actually relational. It's about old grudges, about relationships that we have outside of school. It's about resentments, hopes, connections. Very messy, very, very messy. It's a so communities, whether they are schools or whether they are out in our community or even in a business, are not hierarchies, they're relationships. And sometimes you can have a person who's actually a leader who's not high up on that hierarchy at all, but they are trusted and they are valued for things like you can say things to them and they won't gossip to anyone else, or they will genuinely listen, or they will show you care, or they will stand strong in the face of opposition where everyone else is too afraid to, and yet they don't polarize everything. In other words, I think of it this way, that people often who are on good terms with the world, but they don't compromise a lot to do that. So within this, now our relationship in a system of schooling is quite different. We're not the little one off to the side of some hierarchy. We're actually inside the living mixture of a set of relationships. So, and I think if we go to Lao Tzu, I always think that he put it really well. And this is not a good translation, but basically he argued that leaders, real leaders, are the ones who are so good, whether you're a teacher or whatever capacity you work in, that when you've done your job, the person you're working with, the student, whoever, says, I did this myself. I learned to read myself. This is the fine art of us being invisible, of having huge influence and being invisible, that our ego does not demand the price of payment by attention. It's the thing, you know, you've got the example of those people who come up years later and we have trouble recognizing them because they grow up and don't realize that they don't look the same after 5 years. And we do, just a little more wrinkled, you know, and they say, they normally introduce it with, you won't remember me. And then they tell you something that will break your heart, and you don't even remember doing it or saying it. But they understand that they got to their place in the world because of them. Not, they may know that you created a world for them or gave them some protection, but the greatness of your leadership lies in the fact that they don't go, I can't specifically say what you did. What I know was you gave me a home in the world in which I could recover my sense of it being intelligent, or recover my sense of being worth something in the world. So this idea has been there for centuries and centuries, but actually I believe it's very transferable into our contemporary world. So I'm going to ask you to do something. Now you can cheat on this one because no one's going to see, because you're in your living room or whatever, but you might find this a really helpful thing to do, both for what it'll show you and for something that you will do for someone else. If you think in your world, dissolve the hierarchy, forget the hierarchy, think in your world of somebody who influences people. So they lead by influence. In other words, people gravitate towards them, but they're not on the top of the hierarchy, whether it's in your community or whether it's in your place of work. And just write down on a bit of paper, or even with your finger on your hand, write those two names down. You're not going to have to call them out. This is to you. Write down two people who you would see are invisible leaders who influence, but not by hierarchical position. It may even be in your family. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Even if you've got one name, this is going to help, because this is the next step. And no one's going to know if you do this or not, except if you're in a group and someone's looking at you and going, I hope you wrote my name down. But let's have a look at the next thing. Imagine that tomorrow you were that person and you got an email or a comment from someone like you who said, I was thinking last night about people who really lead in the world. And I think you're one of them. And this is the reason. You may have put your arm around the shoulder of someone who's never had that said to them, who've never had that recognized, but you recognize it because of the way you are in the world. It would take very little to reach out, but probably mean a huge amount. It may be a child. We're not used to being told that we are leaders unless we hold high positions. But we've come through COVID, we've come through floods, we've come through difficult polarizing in our societies. To actually tell somebody who is not is not positionally in a hierarchy, to recognize and be able to say why they show great gifts in leadership, is a very powerful and intimate thing that you can do. Okay, so on to something. So I kind of been thinking about what if we are more than support to the hierarchy? We are support to learning. And I've been doing quite a bit of work recently around the interesting thing about what do we actually learn in classrooms and what do we learn elsewhere. So sometimes we inhabit a little bit of time in the classroom and then we're in the playground or we're in other environments. But so here's a really interesting thing. Look at this. We learned our first language outside of a classroom. We learned how to explain and persuade outside of a classroom. If you've raised kids know how to explain and persuade at 3, very selectively. They can push the buttons. That was a very complex skill. Their psychomotor skills, most of their psychomotor skills, the really complex one, are developed outside of a classroom. But also, they learn to imagine outside of a classroom. That cognitively, intellectually, is a very complex thing, imagination. But don't worry, I won't go into the high discussion of neuroscience around it, but it's a very complex thing. And here's another thing. Most of our skills in reading, I know this is going to sound like heresy, but most of our skills in reading, we actually learn outside of the classroom. So for instance, if you look at how you read today and what you read, and you ask yourself, where did my skills in reading actually develop? There will have been some in some formal lessons, but most of it will have been in the voluntary reading that you learn to do, that you do outside of school. Outside of school, we also learn to interpret visual cues, like how to read diagrams. Unless you're doing a kit set, and then none of us know how to do it, and we cut things off and they don't work. Okay. We learn skills. So there are many mathematical skills that we don't learn at school. So the most common mathematical skill that we use is our ability to estimate. So you were estimating before you came here, going, have I got time to put the spuds on before I sit down? You know, am I going to have the time after here to get this done? What can I fit into this time? Because I also I want to catch that on TV, or I want to phone somebody. But we also estimate things like when we're in the car, we go, am I driving too fast or too dangerously for these conditions? But here's the really complex one that we learn, the mathematical skill. We learn to estimate value. We go, is this likely? Is this worth this much? Or is the time I spend arguing with this person actually going to be a valid use of time? So estimating value is a very, very complex thing. And it bleeds because numeracy is not maths. And maths is not a box like that. Maths bleeds into other things as other things bleed. Disciplines are a false way of understanding the complexity of knowledge. But these skills are hugely important. So, and the other thing we learn to do is to think without a teacher. We learn to think on our own. So all of these skills, there are a whole lot of other ones, but all of these skills, am I going to remember when I get down there? I can't say shout out to me because it's not going to go across the motu, but no, I'll cover it now. Let me give you an example of estimation of something so as part of my job, my other part of the job is I direct film. And we were trying to shoot a war scene in a quarry because for the Egyptian desert. We had to get a kind of a shelter built. And a guy came, it had been raining, and a guy came in who's a production designer. So it's like a set design. And I said, you know, can you give us a quote on how much it would take to do this? And he walked around and he came back. He took about 5 minutes walking round, came back, and he said, be about 5,400. So he had no pencil or anything. And I said, how do you work that out? And he said, well, you're in a quarry. So the ground base is rock, which is going to be quite hard to dig into. The paddock over there is wet, so we're not going to be able to bring the trucks in with the timber. So I'm going to have to get a labourer to carry some of that stuff in. The shelter we can make the set out of boxing timber instead of tannalized timber because it's a temporary set. He broke down all these variables of weather, density of soil, time, materials by estimation, and came up with a quote. Now, this guy is famous. He's a New Zealander, but he's famous all over the world as a production designer. He had embodied knowledge that enabled him to calculate something through estimation. And he also knew how anally retentive I was about everything being perfect. So he knew it wasn't just something you could slap together. And, you know, I said to him, you have amazing mathematical ability. And you can probably guess this. He said, I failed maths at school. And I said, you never failed maths anywhere in the world. You have the most amazing ability with mathematics. So we're going to come to embodied knowledge in a moment, but I've kind of been wrestling with so if intelligence is not this thing that we use for measuring people, if it is much more beautiful than that, what is it? So I know this will look very simple. It's taken about 5 years to get to here. This is what I think it is. I think intelligence is our ability to productively solve problems. So it means that it is an ability, and it does solve the problems, and it does it productively, but it may not necessarily use rational thinking to do it, or it may not use convergent thinking to do it. But it definitely is used there to get us to a better place than where we're stuck at the time. So given that, I thought it might be interesting to have a look at a couple of things. I think that IQ is one of the most toxic things that ever leaked into education, because it does not measure intelligence. Okay, what it does is it measures the ability to work with numerical or logical reasoning or verbal and spatial intelligence, those things, those limited things. So here's some things it can't do. It can't test the ability to ask a good question, or to even know whether a question is worth asking. You know, in truth, a great classroom is not one where people are answering questions, it's when they're asking great questions. You know, a great relationship with you, you know, where you're teaching someone to read or helping something with something. The great talent is when they ask great questions. That's when we know something's alive. Nor does it do this. It does not test the ability to work at and eventually solve large and difficult problems over a long period of time. You sit down with a clock ticking and a set of exercises that remain inside the numerical and logical reasoning. And then we have the audacity to call that an intelligent quotient. And in very flawed education, people use that as a way of measuring. You know, this is Holt back in 1982, who I think was a wonderful writer. So this has been recognized for a long time. And yet many of us have still done that damn Women's Weekly article that said, test your intelligence. And we go, oh, I'm scared. Oh, I'm never going to tell anyone that that was my number. It wasn't a measure of your intelligence. It was never a measure of your intelligence. And nor is it a measure of any injured child who has been handed a number like that and told that that somehow describes who they are and how they think. And so I wanted to share with you some of the things that I've kind of been working on recently. It started, so I've actually got a really lovely job. I mainly work with people who are doing their PhDs. So these are really, really often bright, but very uneven thinkers, very uneven. So, and many of them talk about people like you. They talk about school being uncomfortable or difficult for them. They were told they had ADHD, or they were too easily distracted, or they got bored, or they were naughty, or they had trouble learning to read, but they could do acrobatics with mathematical thought. So they often are very uneven. And one of the things I've noticed is that our education system is based on the idea of linear intelligence, and to be able to go here and then here and then here and then here. Here's a good essay. We write an introduction, then this paragraph leads to this paragraph, leads to this paragraph, leads to this conclusion. Or show your thinking. I did this, then this, then this, then this. But actually, that's not true of everybody. Some of us don't think in a line. We think in like a matrix. Or imagine you're playing chess and you've got 15 layers of glass and you're moving something here and it's affecting something here and here and here. So we actually, our intelligence works in a map, and it sparks at different places. And so we get a sense of the whole, but not in a line. And so we have to learn to lie when someone says, show us your working, and you go, oh, how do I tell this story? So we have to make up a story. So part of that is a thing called tacit knowing. Tacit knowledge is when you have knowledge, but you can't explain where it came from. You can't explain what it is, but you are using it. So often you will be using that when you're working with a student. A child, you'll be making decisions based on something, but you can't put your finger on it, but you are using it. So when people like Donald Schoen wrote a very famous book about the reflective practitioner, he was studying people who made brilliant decisions, but they were doing it based on some kind of intuitive knowing, but it was knowing. It was knowing. And often it's not linear. It's not linear. And yet the template we hold over most formal learning is to be able to relate knowledge and thinking in a line. So when I worked with Gurbaran, so Gurbaran in the end couldn't finish his degree, but he's one of the most intelligent people I've ever worked with. What's that? It's the sound of the baby's first words. He developed an ability to translate sound into objects. His work, he was at the biennales all over the world. His work is huge, it's hugely complex intelligence, but cannot put things in a line. But he can break rules and get to places that rational linear thought can't. And this one, translative intelligence. You might recognize this in yourself. Well, I've just made up this term for it because I can't find anyone who's named it yet. But this is my nephew, Alex. And that's a self-portrait with an onion. And you go, what? What? Well, like, let me put it this way. A few years ago, I was in Shanghai, and parents of one of the students I've been working with in New Zealand took me to a concert, and it was a pianist and called Liang Liang, and he was playing Chopin, played all the stuff. The room was packed. It was amazing. And then he said, "I'm going to play Tan Dun, who's a composer often for music scores in films. You think about him." And he played piece of music called 8 Memories of My Village in watercolor. And people just cried. He painted, he in sound could create a watercolor. In sound, he could create a watercolor. He could go from one medium, break it down and reorder it into a completely different form, and you were listening to watercolor. There was no one in that room who was not listening to watercolor. He didn't have to say what the title of this was. He had the ability to translate from, it's your child who dances fire, and it's fire. They can take the experience of one thing, break it down, reorder it, and compose it into something else in a completely different paradigm. So imagine this. Imagine that you've gone tramping, and being Kiwis, probably lots of us have kind of had this experience. It's late at night, and you've woken up, and you've got to go to the wharepaku or whatever, and you come back, and you're sitting beside a lake by yourself, and you're looking at the stars. Now, some people, and a man called Chopin had this ability, could look at that and write a nocturne. He could write the essence of the night in music. That's not being arty. That's a very, very complex form of intelligence, yet nowhere in education do we have any system for measuring it or understanding it, other than someone like you who goes, "Do you know, that's amazing that you can dance fire? You know, you are really, really intelligent, because most people can't do that." So here's another one, embodied intelligence. And embodied intelligence is something that we often see in architects, we often see in teachers, we will see in gardeners and business people and actors, in kapahaka. It's when our deepest form of knowing happens inside practice, inside doing stuff. So when we are inside the process of making something, whether it's inside the process, you're working with a child and you're seeing something in there that other people haven't seen, and you're pushing the buttons to get them to somewhere else. It's when an architect is using materials and moving them around on a table, and they're talking to them. There's a dialogue happening inside the materials. It's when a business person is right in the middle of business, and they are reading off being embodied inside the problem. It's like an actor who becomes that character to be able to create another version of that character. So embodied knowledge has had a bit of a rough spin in education, because many decades ago, we started elevating the ability to abstract knowledge, to take knowledge away from its physical form and go, that's less than someone who can do it all up here. It's not less, it's different. Some of our most gifted designers, teachers, architects, business people, you may in fact turn the greatest somersaults with intelligence inside an embodied way of thinking, but you can't enter that on a test form. So, because we're nearly up, I'm going to just cover another couple of things. You know, I was talking before about how sometimes we have time. We have time. For a child, they feel that we've got more time with them. And one of the issues, you know, I don't like the word well-being because it sounds like my name, and everyone thinks my parents were burned out hippies who called me well-being. They didn't. Well-being wasn't a thing in 1956. So I like hauora, and actually I like it as a term because it's got a kind of more of a spiritual element in it, a greater depth. So I'm not a guy who thinks that doing mindful exercises fixes. I know probably a lot of people are very angry at me for this, but I actually think the issue is we have to find what's causing stress, not how do we deal with stress. We have to go to the roots of what causes it. That's where we are most productively likely to solve the problem. But one of the things that we know the kids we're working with, and many of us here sitting here tonight, we've worked across generations. We know that this is a serious issue now, that we have kids managing huge levels of anxiety, huge levels of feeling alone or dislocated or not good enough, being afraid to say, afraid to talk. And that's where I come back to the thing. This time, we have time sometimes. And we have a different construct around us that enable us to get to something that a formal teacher in a classroom can't get to. And sometimes, you know, it's not happening at home. It's not happening at home. And we're all flawed. You know, we're not gods. We're flawed in a flawed system. But we've got an opportunity to try and do something. So, and this is difficult because these kids live in a world where things are valued by how much they're liked, not how good they are. So their compass for recognizing what is of value is often distorted. And so they also think that something is wrong because it's not liked, or it doesn't have enough attention paid to it. So things like subtlety and nuance often don't have the same meaning that they did for generations, 2 generations earlier. They live in a world where they're being taught that the world is competitive. It's not. You imagine if you tried to get home tonight, if everybody on the road was being competitive. You imagine if you tried to do anything to get tomorrow at work and everyone was being competitive. I don't think we live in a competitive world. I think we live in a world where we are strategically cooperative. We cooperate with others strategically to get the things we need or to make the world better in which we can all function. So to teach people that you're in competition with something, I think is a dumbed down analysis of a world that we live in. So we're going to jump the beer, and it's only because I run out of time. So I want to finish like this, so we've got a few times for questions. There's there's 2 Greek words that I think are really interesting, and they're the origin of the word enthusiasm. So enthusiasm comes from these 2 words, en, meaning inner, and theos, meaning God. If you are enthusiastic, what you have is an inner God still burning. And people are attracted to enthusiastic people. They're attracted to the warmth, to the hope, that they don't get consumed by cynicism. They stay there in the parallel spaces, supporting, giving home and support to people who need it. It is such a magnificent thing to have entheos inside you. And so, if it hasn't been said to you just recently, for all the invisible stuff that you do, for all the profound leadership that you show and influence, for all the messy times when we can't get it right because there is no right, but we still hang in there. On behalf of our nation, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, you've gone on mute again, Mark.
I keep muting. Gosh,
No.
I can see by the number of hearts that's flowing up the screen here, Welby, that you really hit a rich vein with everyone who's listening. It's been absolutely terrific listening to all the points you put forward, and particularly linking through to the important work that and space that people provide, support staff, particularly in schools. So we've got a few questions already in the Q&A, and we'll just pop those through to you, Welby, and just see what you might want to say in response to these. So I see one here from Mei Lin. She's referred to the wounded hierarchies that you talked about. What she would like to know is, how would you create forums for whānau, senior management and students to have the kind of kōrero that you shared tonight?
Right. So so this is a really good question, and I'm not a god, so I can't see your context. But something like that happened to me once, and I just used that diagram of the relational picture with all the arrows because it makes people laugh, but it's actually a fundamental truth. And go, what would happen if we talked about our community as relationships? Then what is of value? Who's a leader in something like this? So you can see in the way I put this together, because I grew up in a world of pictures because words were difficult for me. I find pictures a great catalyst. And I also find that I don't find challenging people works. It just puts people's backs in the corner. But seducing with humor or recognition sometimes does. So this is something, all I can do is answer it for something that I did, knowing that that will either work for you or it won't. But something like a picture like that, or a situation that doesn't threaten people, but actually raises a very different way of looking at something that people recognize, can often get high buy-in. Otherwise, we end up discussing the issue instead of what's actually happening. And so it's a really good question, and it's a really good question for 6:50 at night. So if you've managed to endure that kind of perception, that's somebody's very lucky to have you in the world. And it's also a lovely question because it's so oriented towards making something better for other people. So that would be my answer, but it's not an absolute. I understand it can't be absolute.
Ngā mihi. I'm quite glad that Mark jumped into that first question, because I was still having a bit of just thank you. Acknowledgement really means a lot, and to really see us really means a lot to us. So I'm going to be not a suki baba to us. Sarah's amazing question. If you had a person like us alongside you or available in your space when you were at school for you to trust and know that you were supported, what difference might that have made to you, and what would the skills that would they possess to make that difference for you?
Sure. So I did, I did. I had Mrs. Harrod in the library, and I had Mr. Tate, the groundsman, and Miss Wilson in the office. And I lived in the shelter of their recognition of my value. And outside of that, I also had my mum and dad who would not let me be dumb. They would not let me, because I learned how to perform dumb. I could get out of so much work, and I'd had a damn twin sister who was there, dancing in golden slippers around the world. I love her to bits. But they would never see a difference between us. They would never go, that's the dumb one and that's the bright one. All the brains went there. They wouldn't do that. And so I had those people just like someone has you right now. The thing that I think is so important, was important for me, was they didn't measure my worth. They didn't measure it with a a mark or a grade or they didn't measure it. But so one thing I find really interesting, because it worked with me and I've seen other people do it. You know, when people go, "Oh, you're awesome," you go, "Damn, you know, that's not true," because your bullshit detector is so good. It's so good. You know, fake praise, and it's so patronizing. You might not know the word patronizing, but you know what that is. But what is devastating is when someone asks your opinion and really listens to it and talks to you about it. Or even more profoundly, someone asks you to show them how to do something that you realize they don't know how to do. That's huge, because it's not talking about value, it's showing value. And when you have lost faith in the learning providers around you, someone who shows you that they value your knowledge is worth 150 people saying they value your knowledge. I don't know if that's helpful.
It's not helpful for me being a Suki Lala, but yeah, we do have those opportunities, and it is pretty special with our rhinoceri. Could I ask, what would be, with your magic wand, and you've changed what school structures look like, what would it, just in a short amount of time, what would a school look like for rhinoceri?
Okay, so I don't believe we will ever change schools. I know this sounds awful, but we change lives within them. So I don't think investing the hope on the institution is the wise use. It's investing the hope in people. That's what does it. So I think that institutions generally put their concerns into preserving the institution. It's not that they're bad, that's just what they kind of have to do. But within that, we have the impact on people's lives, and let me give you a concrete example. My dad once told me this. He said, if somebody tattoos their values on their arms and shows it to you, be afraid, be very afraid. Somebody who talks their stuff, that's dangerous. But someone who lives those things, that's a different story. So in a school that goes, here are our 5 values, you just go, it's a tattooed arm. It's a tattooed arm. But some educator in there, somebody who's living those values, we remember those things. They're not things to be written on walls. They're things to be lived in the heart. And I believe that even in a damaged hierarchy, and we've all lived and worked, we might be right now in parts of something that's damaged. But when we seize the power inside ourselves and go, no, this is not, I'm not going to waste my oxygen changing the institution, because the revolution's not coming on Wednesday. It's not coming. The revolution happened yesterday and today in small ways that touch in profound ways people's lives who will go out and live in the world. So I shift my energy away from trying to change the mega and push it. And that's what the idea behind disobedient teaching was, that we invested into the depth of smaller things, but actually in the long term, it has profound implications.
I love that. I think we've got time for just one more question. That's from Margie, and she's challenging in a good way. She's asking, would you say that linear learning is detrimental to people's learning and development?
No, I would say that because some people are linear, but to narrow an education system down without critically thinking about how people think is a dangerous thing. So for instance, if I have to write a letter of complaint to some Mitre 10, or sorry, not whatever, some business. Sorry, I just picked that out of the world, Mitre 10. Yeah. So I need to be able to frame an argument in a linear way. That's one skill. But to actually uncritically construct an education system so predicated on linear accounting and knowledge is a dangerous thing, given that we have this rich spectrum of ways of thinking. And that's why I think it's helpful for us to talk about intelligence, even if we don't have the name for it. It's not quoting people. It's just talking about how do I think? How do I productively solve problems? And if we start talking like that beyond these parameters of linearity or IQ or these ways of the great gods of literacy and numeracy holding the gates to where we go, if we step back from that, we find ways of understanding the beauty of the intelligence of people with whom we work. And sometimes those are kids who are called quite bright, but actually what they are is articulate instead of intelligent. They're smooth, very smooth. It's great, but they don't actually bring new knowledge into the world. What they do is read agendas and meet, it's a skill, and meet that very well. But it doesn't mean that they change the course of thought. They learn to align with the course of thought.
I really hate that we have to finish this conversation.
Everyone needs their dinner.
Really flown by. Anga mihi nunu ki a koe. Just so I've got a lot of pieces of paper with a lot of tiny words on them that I'm going to go and think about. But just thank you for being with us, and I'll hope everyone here has got their brain exploding as well. Thanks everyone for coming, and I hope you will continue to celebrate the amazing mahi that you do with our tamariki across the land. And Mark's just going to close with karakia.
Yeah, kia ora, Ellie, and thank you so much, Welby. I'm a massive fan of our support staff. My school couldn't function without them, and it's terrific that we've had an opportunity for them to listen to you. You're always wonderful to listen to. I love that you called out the IQ test. Benet himself, the actual man who created them, said one single score cannot define intelligence. It's far too complex, and you nailed that tonight for us. So thank you very much for that. So I'm going to close with a karakia, and hopefully everyone returns back to a wonderful other world that you've come from. Ke whakarea te tapu, ke wātia ai te ara, ke turuki whakataha ai, ke turuki whakataha ai. Haumie, hui tai kia. Restrictions are moved aside, so the pathway is clear. Return to everyday activities. Kia ora.